Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable Podcast, the only show that dares to be both on topic and on location. Each time we meet, we bring together a group of IT luminaries to discuss a single concept. In this episode, we're talking Whitebox storage. Is it a good idea? Before we begin, let's meet who's on the panel today. I'm Stephen Foskett, organizer of Tech Field Day and publisher of Gestalt IT. You can find me on Twitter at @sfoskett, and you'll find a lot of my writing at gestaltit.com.
Hi, I'm Jason Benedicic. I'm an independent consultant from the UK. You can find me on Twitter at JABenedicic, and I blog over on thedatacenterbrit.co.uk.
Hello, I'm Vuong Pham. I work as a senior solutions architect for VAR in Southern California, and you can find me on Twitter at digital_kung fu.
Hello, my name is Arjan Timmerman. I'm an IT architect in the Netherlands. I work with tegunplug.io, and you can find me on the Twitter at ArjanTim.
Hi, my name is Chris Mackey, and I'm a principal solutions architect for a large VAR in Canada located on the West Coast. And you can find me on Twitter at Chris Mackey.
So those of us in the storage industry for a long time have, we've often rolled our own storage. I did a lot with FreeNAS, for example, and ZFS, and honestly, I love it. And we've seen a lot more movement in that direction now that Linux is gotten out there and is such a reliable, such a dominant operating system. Now that there are so many, ZFS for one thing, but also a lot of open storage protocols for another thing, object storage. I think we're starting to see a situation where actual IT admins are thinking about rolling their own storage for production use. What do you guys think of this? Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? Should we say that this is something that companies should do or not?
I'll start first. I think you have to take this with a lot of caution. There's a lot of good intention with Whitebox storage, and you're right. The evolution of network speed, the evolution of protocol, and stability of protocol is great. But some of the key tenets and the foundation of enterprise storage is missing in a Whitebox storage. I would say the things that you don't really appreciate as a consumer would be manufacturing controls, tolerance, those type of things that are not present. And just the availability becomes a bigger issue. I mean, granted, software protocols can compensate for some of that, but the reliability and stability and consistency of performance, I challenge that for a Whitebox solution.
It's also a people thing, if you ask me. If you've got someone in your organization that is building that for you, and what if he leaves? Someone else needs to take it over, and 9 out of 10 times there's a lot of documentation missing, so they don't know what they've done and why they've done certain things. So from that perspective, I think it's also a bad idea to go into whiteboxing.
I think what you're getting along there is to do with support, really. And what can't be forgotten about here is the level of support you can get with enterprise storage and distribution channels. And when a drive goes bad in the middle of the night, how it's sitting on your desk when you get there in the morning. That's of paramount importance to me with enterprise storage.
And I think a lot of this comes down to scale. And the problem is that we've had a few unicorns over the last few years that have a scale that no one else is ever going to be. It's okay if you're Facebook or Instagram or the hyperscaler cloud providers. You have scale, you have engineering, you have time, money, resources to take a Whitebox solution and build it into your own enterprise solution. But your average business is never going to be that size.
So I think there is a place for Whitebox. I just don't think it's always the right place is the enterprise.
I agree. It's a great place to maybe do some learning and figure out how stuff works. But back to the one person who built it in the company that's the whole what's the character's name in the Phoenix Project? The guy who has all the keys to the kingdom in his head. That's what it boils down to.
So you built an entire process around this one individual, which as they say, could be hit by a bus. That's bad.
So these are all great reasons why not to build your own storage. Essentially, you've got supportability, you've got the, guy hit by a bus scenario. But that doesn't change the fact that a lot of companies are building their own storage. They are rolling their own storage. And, I think there's two reasons for this. Number one, there's just a lot of easy to use software out there. And so it's something that you can practically do. And, kind of setting aside hyperscalers for the moment, I would say that the other reason is because the nature of storage is really changing. So let's take this first one, though. There are a lot of software products out there that you could roll your own storage. Can you guys see any situation where those would be a good idea? Like, is there a time that you want to use, what was called FreeNAS, but is now called TrueNAS, for example? Is there any application that you'd want to see something like that deployed in enterprise?
I think if you've got some specific requirements, maybe you've got some edge use cases, maybe you need to build, especially like the IoT space or the AI ML space. If you need to build something custom, something ruggedized, and you've got a different hardware footprint, or you don't have the availability of the standard storage offerings, something that's got to go in a autonomous car, for example, you might want to build something yourself because you want to fit it in the car. And same with maybe battlefield storage and things like that.
Well, you hit that on the head. I mean, I think there's in a lab environment, in a testing environment, prior to production or narrow use cases, a white box storage could be appropriate. Steven mentioned the fact that software has enabled organizations and individuals to do things that they couldn't do in the past because that secret code that is now available to you to use and to test. But bear in mind that doesn't relieve you from being responsible, because data is hard to keep intact and to keep reliable. So you got to be careful, because that's the lesson of overriding enterprise or white box. So yes, you can do it, but be careful in how you do it and how you scale it or how you put it to use.
Yeah, I think this is what we're discussing here is point solutions, and it might be appropriate, some of these point solutions, but if you have to involve any sort of ecosystem, you need partners to be on board with your product. So there's integration. So like application aware snapshots, things like that, anything that integrates with the ecosystem. If you don't need that, then maybe as or custom built storage is an answer.
Yeah, I agree on that. There's definitely a couple of use cases where white boxes could be something the enterprise could use it. But then again, you really need to make sure that you're going to do the stuff that you need to do. And from a perspective that if something goes wrong, you need to know exactly where to go and what's going on. So yeah, a bit of expertise with the people that matter to that is really needed.
So in terms of white box, let's think about this. So, there's a difference between literally like going on the internet and buying a bunch of commodity or components and putting them together yourself, or, going out and buying like a ProLiant server and running Windows Server on it and using it as a file server. Would you guys consider a Windows file server to be a roll your own white box storage, or would you consider that a different category?
I'd say that's a different category. I don't think that it's not a fully prepackaged solution, but it's software that you didn't have to really glue together to make work.
I think that's like a prosumer level where you're mixing a little bit of good and a little bit of, ingenuity there. So you could have, sure, you have a file system that's on enterprise grade hardware like a ProLiant, but if you go and say the software that runs on it, is that going to be enterprise grade? So that's the question you have to ask. Does that framework have the performance and availability you need? Because you've already taken care of the hardware problem. That's my major concern, is dealing with quality hardware that's been spec'd and supported. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have what you need otherwise.
I think there's a middle ground. I mean, we've all used kind of Windows storage spaces and Windows storage server before for remote offices or other use cases. And I've used a number of solutions from Sun and other people back then. I think it's the difference between what's commodity, as in just I could grab anything off the shelf, and what's a supportable solution that I'm buying from a reputable vendor, and I'm buying a support package with it, and I'm paying to be able to ring somebody and say, hey, my server's on fire, my software's on fire, help.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to be, from an operations perspective, I wouldn't want to be the one saying, I can't recover 2 terabytes of storage. It's gone. I have all that data, all the man hours involved to create that data that you've analyzed and you have value and your business depends on. I don't want to be the one that says I can't recover it. So that's the scary part. But performance-wise, it's to Whitebox storage credit, it's getting really good. I mean, you look at the commodity hardware, the level of quality is increased. You're not going to get junk out of the box, but it may take you longer to find the bad sectors or the bad drives or the firmware problems and bugs. But it's your use case, like Chris was saying, a point use case, and you have to determine what's going to be appropriate, and it could work. Don't get me wrong.
So you could say, though, that in this modern world, almost everyone's going to be rolling their own storage. So I'm going to challenge you guys again. So think about, like, what does a progressive data center look like? What does a modern data center look like? We're talking about a system that has vSAN. That's roll your own storage. We're talking about a system that has, some kind of, cloud native Kubernetes integrated storage. That's roll your own storage, isn't it? I mean, really, are we already at an end of thinking of storage arrays as like a separate thing that you buy?
No.
Yes. You look at the amount of data being generated by the consumer today. Photos, videos, iPhones, whatever devices you have. If you're not in the cloud, you have your data somewhere. And it's going to be, and unfortunately, a lot of people just have it on their laptop. So I think that the solution has a niche, and it could be really good for the consumer or for those point use cases to have something more resilient than a single device. But I think there's a lot of potential.
You raised a great point on vSAN, and it's not roll your own storage. Because somebody, a large engineering team, have taken that time to work out compression, deduplication, wear leveling, trim, all of those different things that if you just go and install some software, open source or anything else, you haven't had somebody do all that for you. You're having to take into that account yourself. You're having to tweak the TCP/IP settings. You're having to tweak the buffers and the hardware settings and everything else. Roll your own storage is that I'm going to control every part of it. vSAN's an off-the-shelf product.
So you wouldn't consider that to be roll your own storage?
Absolutely not.
The question then is, what is your understanding of whiteboxing? Because if vSAN isn't, what is? Only if you are going to do everything for yourself, just get a Linux kernel and do everything yourself, that's a white box?
Not necessarily. vSAN has a hardware compatibility list, as do most of the other software solutions out there. So
there's also a lot of software solutions that will give you a lot of the things you just mentioned. So there's, of course, the people that will just do a Linux kernel and do everything themselves, but there's also a lot of very good software that already figured that out for you.
Would you say that Whitebox is defined by the ability to buy support? Or not?
In part, I think that's a huge component of it. vSAN, I agree with Jason. It's not roll your own. It's not Whitebox. There's a lot of engineering, because I used to, have that badge and work for the organization. I know. So the thing is that Whitebox solution, let's say, here's one that you've mentioned FreeNAS, but there's also ZFS. ZFS is a huge protocol, and it's not a predominant, but it's out there as a Whitebox solution. And people have 10 gig networks at home, Ethernet, and then they have access to super fast SSDs, and they can go buy a generic power supply unit in case and put it in a computer, or buy a computer and retrofit it. So and what happens? That magic software makes things happen.
So what about Nexenta or something like that?
I mean, I've heard of Magic vSAN and Magic SAN and all that stuff. It's software. Software is changing how people consume all these IT resources, and it's just a matter of your comfort and what it can do for you.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is that a lot of this stuff is better and better. I mean, there would have been a time when we would have said, oh my gosh, you're running Linux in production? Are you kidding me? But now, I don't think that anybody would argue that, you shouldn't run Ubuntu in production. I mean, it's fine. Same thing, honestly, with, some of these other things. You look at, the open source stuff. I mean, you're running Rancher or whatever, and you roll out a storage container. Is that not the same thing? I mean, it's not necessarily supported. You don't necessarily have a support contract on it, but it works. Isn't that where we're going? Isn't that where the whole industry is going?
Only at the cost savings approach. I think that purchasing, what we might call proper enterprise storage will seem expensive at first blush, but you have to take in the total cost of ownership of a Whitebox solution. And if you don't have the bodies or the brains to throw at it, then it's not the right solution for you.
So I guess that's the core question then. It of course, like everything on this podcast, the answer is always it depends. But the answer to this one, I think, maybe is a little less it depends, because I depending on how we phrase this, I think the answer is very clear. I'll give you guys a chance to speak, but from my perspective, it depends on whether it's truly roll your own hardware or if it's supported hardware. It depends on if it's truly roll your own software or it's supported software. It depends on a lot of things like that. But the question of hardware versus software, I think, is maybe not something that depends. So I guess, Chris, what do you think? Should you run your own Whitebox software?
Well, I'll paraphrase you. It does depend, but for me, it depends on your ability to deploy and maintain it and your comfort level of maintaining it yourself. There's a reason I don't roll my own. I run a QNAP at home. So I used to roll my own, but I'm tired of science projects in my basement.
Yeah, I think it's just that maybe there are companies that will have a good time doing it because they've got the resources to do it, and they just do it. But most of the companies will go for something that's supported and well known, and where they can just rely on the storage they buy.
Well, the Whitebox market is definitely an attractive option for some organizations. To your arguments, I would say that the baling wire and duct tape of the past is much better. You can do a lot more with off the shelf stuff than you could in the past, and it could be on par with some enterprise storage. But the only thing you really can't measure until something goes wrong is what everyone has alluded to. When something does go wrong, what options do you have to fix, to support, to rectify the situation? I would say, I don't have time to go to a forum, post a question, and hope somebody in their spare time answers the question about the bug I'm having. That doesn't bode well for my situation. So that's some things to consider.
I'm going to take a rather boring angle on. I'm going back to the whole premise of how you should run a business in general. If it's core to your business, build it. If not, buy it. And everyone should learn from that. That's the core tenet of how you run good businesses and how you make money these days.
Yeah, and I guess that's really the bottom line, isn't it? If you're going to be using it in production, then you need to make sure that it's reliable, supportable, that it has the features you need. I mean, all those things that we've always looked for in enterprise storage. And I think that that's really what it comes down to. There's no reason that you can't use software to create storage. There's no reason you can't even use roll your own hardware, depending on how supportable and what kind of hardware it is. But if the entire solution isn't supportable, isn't reliable, isn't maintainable, isn't documented, then you absolutely shouldn't do it. Except for your lab or for your home or to learn. And so there are still options out there. And I think that to me, that's really the coolest thing about white box storage and roll your own storage is that, we're in a time when even some of the more advanced systems are available as, kind of NFR software only, run it in your house versions or a virtual appliance or something. And so we can learn and we can, try something out without, having to buy a bunch of hardware or something. And that's honestly pretty cool. So thanks for listening to the On-Premise IT Roundtable. If you enjoyed this discussion, remember to subscribe, rate, and review the show in iTunes, since that really does help our visibility. And please share the show with your friends. This podcast was brought to you by GestaltIT.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise. For show notes and more episodes, go to GestaltIT.com/podcast. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.